a little more accurate.
You're up first. Well, not.
Sometimes I see that big white ball.
Yeah, I've seen those too. Yeah.
That's what it is. Sometimes they pay one the other.
Oh, yeah. Yep, he's going to cue it up. Penny, you want to put it on? He sets it up. Ready when you are. Or Laura.
I'll call the February 22nd, 2022 Planning Commission meeting to order. First order of business is a moment of silence and then the Pledge of Allegiance. May I have a roll call, please?
Yes, Madam Chair. Ms. Townsend? Here. Ms. Butler?
Here.
Mr. Moyer?
Here.
Ms. Pearson?
Here.
Ms. Thomas?
Here.
Mr. LaRochelle?
Here.
Dr. Schmidt?
Here.
Mr. Davis?
Here.
Mr. Bennett?
Here.
Mr. Tiller?
Here.
Ms. Rose?
Here.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Now we are going to defer the January 18th minutes approval until the March meeting. So we'll move on to the citizen comment period. All right, seeing that no one has signed up to comment, Kelly, there are no presentations and there's no unfinished business. There are also no public hearings this evening, so we'll move directly into the new business and the discussion of solar and renewable energy facilities and development of ordinances surrounding those facilities.
Okay. Searching for the mouse. It's always the fun part.
Kelly,
Yeah, go ahead.
before we get started, could you give us just a very brief rundown on the resolution that came to staff from the Board of Supervisors?
Okay. So a couple months ago, as you know, we've been starting to get a lot of solar inquiries in as far as conditional use permits for projects of all different sizes, and we've had a lot of meetings with potential applicants about pre-applications for these. So the board passed a resolution kind of directing staff and the Planning Commission to look at these, look at solar as a whole, and kind of come up with some possible performance standards. Right now, we review all solar projects regardless of size as conditional use permits, which is fine, and that's how a lot of other localities do it. But given the issues that have come up with the one that's out there now in Barhamsville, particularly buffering, setbacks, stormwater issues that came up, they wanted us to kind of take a closer look at potential impacts these projects could have and if there are better ways to deal with them, aka performance standards. So as part of a educational piece, we've been talking about this over the last couple of months, and that's going to continue tonight. We got a couple experts on the commission, which is great. So Gary's going to start with the presentation.
No, thank you, Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. La Rochelle.
Whether I'm an expert or not, I'm going to decide that after.
You are. Just keep the arrow on the screen.
Okay.
You should be good to go.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's kind of a strange angle to be looking at y'all from there when I'm usually facing the other way. Thank you for having me. Hopefully I can provide a little bit of background. I work for Dominion Energy. I've been with Dominion for about 15 years, almost 16 years. So while I'm no expert on the electric industry, I certainly have kind of some idea of the trends and where things are going. Each of us may have our own opinions about these trends and whether we support them or not, but the industry in general is certainly headed in a particular direction. So I thought it would be helpful to kind of highlight how electricity has been generated and distributed in the past, how it's being done now, and what may be coming in the future. So I don't know if anyone on the panel, when you hear megawatts and generation and stuff like that, y'all may not really, it may just kind of seem like black magic. You turn a switch on and the lights work and nobody really knows how it happens. So I'll try to provide a little insight. Before I do, though, I want to disclose to my colleagues on the Planning Commission that last fall, my wife and I entered into an option to purchase agreement for property that we own in New Kent with an energy company. So we are parties to a contract. The day we signed it, I notified Kelly, and I think you even passed it to Brandon. I don't know if this company will develop the project or not, and if it were to come before this committee, obviously I wouldn't vote on it, I wouldn't participate in it, but I didn't want to go through this presentation or anything and keep you guys in the dark. Okay. So everything I'm going to present, I'm going to try to present facts that are open source available, Dominion Energy website, Google, other places. I'll do my best to limit opinions and just give you guys facts so that then you can develop your own opinions from there. Okay, so for decades, electric utilities have been, the challenge that they face is producing exactly the same amount of electricity that is needed at any given time, right? You want to match the source, the supply to the load. Any surplus energy that was generated was lost. That's lost revenue, lost resources. And so using a lot of historical data, utilities can really accurately predict on May 15th the typical load pattern. You know, if it's a weekday, we expect this much. If it's a weekend, we expect this much. And they try to match the generation that's available to the predicted load. So as an example, this is a actual load versus forecasted load. This is for ERCOT, the electric utility in Texas. Texas has its own grid. There's an East Coast grid, a West Coast grid west of the Rocky Mountains, and there's Texas. So there's 3 separate electrical grids in the U.S. As you can see on the graph, the blue line was the actual load, and the red line was what they predicted. It's pretty close, right? So it's almost a science, and they can look at the average weather. You know, there's many factors that go in this, but if they want to know how much generation do we have to have on the 16th of February, and I don't know what year this was, 2017, they're going to look at all these factors and make sure that they have enough generation capacity to meet that demand. If they can't produce it, they'll buy it in the open market. There's a number of ways they can do it, but the goal is always to match supply with demand almost exactly. Going back to the previous slide, so in years past, we had big generators, right? You run a generator, I'm going to speak in general terms, but if you have a generator that's capable of producing 650 megawatts and you run it at 500 megawatts, that gives you room to ramp it up or down if you need it, if another unit trips offline or if the load is higher than you expected. So, but it's nothing more than putting your foot down on a gas pedal, just like in your car where you want to go faster, you put the pedal down. Well, the challenge that's facing the electric industry now is we're doing away with these generators and we're installing solar sites. Well, there's no way anyone can predict. Now, we know what time the sun is going to rise and what time the sun is going to set every day for the next 100 years. We know that. You don't know if it's going to be cloudy. You don't know if your solar panels are going to be dusty or covered with snow or anything else. So there's really no way to exactly predict how much generation capacity you're going to have on any given day. And in this service area, let's say the state of Virginia, it might be cloudy up north, so those solar panels aren't producing, but it's sunny in Virginia Beach, you know? So it's a much more complicated scenario now for electric utilities. So just as a, so traditional coal and gas-fired plants. Chesterfield Power Station, if you've ever gone across the Varina-Enon Bridge, headed south, you look to your right, that's Chesterfield Power Station. Been there for a long time. Right now we have 4 units, units 5, 6, 7, and 8. Units 3 and 4 were recently retired. These are all coal-fired units. 3 and 4 were shut down because Virginia Clean Economy Act and environmental standards, whatever Dominion's decision was based on, units 3 and 4 have been retired. You can see the total output, 1,400 megawatts. So to replace Chesterfield Power Station, the general rule of thumb for solar is it takes 5 to 10 acres of land to produce 1 megawatt. So somebody can do the math on that. To replace 1,400 megawatts, I can't do that math, but it's going to be a lot of land. That's incredible, right? And I don't know, I tried to find how many acres Chesterfield Power Station occupies. I couldn't really find it easily, and I don't want to give you bad information. I would suspect it's certainly several hundred acres, but I can't tell you the megawatt per acre from a power station versus megawatt per acre from a solar site. I don't have that information. So Chesterfield has 2 coal-fired units, 2 natural gas units. Coal-fired units are very simple. With a lot of the old-style generation, it's about producing heat to boil water, to make steam. That steam is then is injected into these turbine blades like a pinwheel, causing them to turn. And those blades are on a shaft. As that shaft turns, it's coupled to a generator, and that produces electricity. So you need a heat source to boil water, to make steam under pressure that you just then inject on a turbine, cause it to spin, produces electricity. So whether it's coal or nuclear is just a different energy source, and certainly a lot of other systems, but once you make the steam, it all works the same with a steam turbine. Clover Power Station is a newer power station, coal-fired, finished in 1996. I think ODEC owns a piece of it with Dominion. 877 megawatts, 2 coal-fired units. So we'll see some pictures here. So this is Chesterfield. First thing you see is the stacks, right? Dominion has put scrubbers. They've done a lot of stuff here to remove some of the bad stuff that comes out of the exhaust. But you can see you've got a huge coal pile right here. If you drive up to the plant, there's trains that come in every day. I don't know if they still come in every day, but they used to come in every day, unload coal. They have a big shaker house. A train rolls in. They uncouple a car, pick it up, shake it upside down, put it back on the rails. Off it goes. The next one comes in. Huge pile of coal. There's conveyor belts and crushers and grinders and pumps and fans and so many auxiliary systems. But ultimately, that coal gets almost pulverized to a powder, like talcum powder, injected into a boiler, ignited, produces heat, boils water, makes steam, spins the turbines. So this is Dutch Gap, right on the river. They're always near water so they can cool the equipment that needs to be cooled. Some of the bad stuff with coal, obviously, having a coal pile in place for a long time. I'm not a scientist, but I think there's generally some bad stuff in coal that probably seeps into the ground. And then the ash that's produced as part of the combustion, that all has to be handled carefully. So coal is a resource we have a lot of, but it's not necessarily clean. Here's Clover Power Station in Clover, Virginia. Looks great. It's a newer station. Coal pile is over here. You can see you got 2 units, big coal-fired units, much cleaner and nicer than Chesterfield, but it's still a coal-fired power station. So you can't get away from the exhaust. So this is an example of coal-fired. This is what powered the grid almost exclusively, probably until the nuclear plants came online in the 60s and 70s. Nowadays, we've also got so this is what you see. If you walked in the turbine deck at Chesterfield Power Station, this would be like Unit 6. You'd have all these big units right there on the deck, on the turbine deck. This is the silver pipes. I'm losing my mouse. This is the steam, where it gets injected in a high-pressure, low-pressure turbine, and then the shaft that comes out spins the generator. This is an example of the turbine that's inside that generator. Incredibly complicated, incredibly expensive. I mean, these are. I mean, I've never bought one, but I'd certainly say these are many, probably hundreds of millions of dollars. If you had to replace that steam turbine, that's a big expense. So that's steam turbines. So now, over the past 15 years, natural gas-fired power stations, Dominion's built 3 of them. Brunswick County, Greensville County are cited here. If you look at the cost for Greensville County, came online in 2018 at $1.3 billion. So these are not cheap. And these are essentially, these turbines are like aircraft engines where they suck air in, compress it, ignite it, and then that pressurized exhaust gas spins turbines, which then spin a shaft and produce electricity. So these are basically like the jet engine you see on the airliner that you flew last time you were in the air. That's what they're using. And then really efficient, what we call combined cycle natural gas stations. You'll have 2 units that the exhaust gas goes through, spins the turbines, produces electricity, but there's still enough heat in that exhaust after that where you can then use it to boil water to make steam, and you'll have a 3rd unit called a steamer that also produces electricity. So here you can see 1,358 megawatts at Brunswick, 1,500 at Greensville, because Greensville has a steamer unit. So this is what they look like. See the 3 units. There's a switch yard. This is where the electricity comes out of the plant, goes in here, and then is connected on wires going out to the service area. A couple of pictures of his Brunswick. These are all pretty new. All right, so renewable energy resources, obviously with the current trend with concern about carbon emissions, we want to eliminate or reduce emissions going into the atmosphere. And so we have what are now called renewable energy resources. Now keep in mind these big billion-dollar power stations that I just showed you, in years past, you had power stations in different locations, right? You had Chesterfield, you had Chesapeake Energy Center, Yorktown, Possum Point up north, Mount Storm out west, various other power stations and other utilities that produce power as well. So you had these centralized places where we produced energy, and then it all just got pushed into the grid and eventually ended up at all of our homes. So the lights come on and we can charge our phones and watch TVs and stuff. Okay, so it's, and normally power stations would be built kind of in if you were going to build a new power station today, like Virginia Hybrid Energy Center, it's out in the country where there's fewer people to be impacted or to object to it or whatever else. But, you know, I don't know that we'll build any more big power stations like that. The economy has changed a lot. And now the trend is toward distributed energy resources. So instead of having these huge power stations, we're going to have little solar farms here and there, and hoping that the sum of all that power that's produced at these solar farms is going to equal these big power units. So solar is one piece of it. Here are the 2 wind turbines that Dominion has built off the coast of Virginia Beach, 27 miles out. These wind turbines are the first 2. There's 176 more to come. From the water line to the top of that turbine blade is as tall as the Washington Monument. These are the 2 small ones. The 176 that are coming are over 900 feet tall. So when you go to New York, you see skyscrapers, that's really what you're looking at with these big turbines. You can see they're going to produce enough power for 660,000 homes. I don't know if you can see them from the beach. I don't really know, but I know years ago when I was in the Navy, I did a deployment to Scandinavia. That sounds like an oxymoron, I know, but all through the coast of Denmark, Sweden, Finland, they had these things everywhere. As far as you could see, they had wind turbines. That's how far behind we are on the renewable, you know, the kind of the wind turbine trend. So this is one option, is wind. And essentially what happens is up here in what's called the nacelle, your turbine blades, your blades spin, providing that rotary motion, and there's a little generator up here that produces electricity. To produce electricity, you need magnets, a conductor, and motion between the 2, and you'll produce electricity. So every one of these things, it's like its own little generator. Then they're all connected, and the power is shipped to shore through underwater cables. This is Mount Storm Wind Farm out in West Virginia. We have a big power station at Mount Storm. You can decide for yourself, right? I mean, I love beautiful natural landscapes, but I also love electricity, right? Most of us are addicted to electricity. Think about, I've heard it said that what separates humans from the animals is electricity. And if you've seen power outages and you know, that last more than 2 or 3 hours, you see some people that straight up act like animals when they lose their power, right? No air conditioning, what do? I can't watch TV, the internet doesn't work. That's how dependent we have become on electricity. So for every option, right, it's clean, but there's going to be objection because you're spoiling the landscape. This is bad for birds, right? They actually have issues with birds and bats and other flying creatures. They're noisy if you live nearby. If they collect ice, they become unbalanced. They have to shut them down. Ice can fly off of these blades and cause damage to homes and cars and stuff. So it's clean, but it's not perfect. And here's some solar sites. So these are just, and this was a quick sampling of solar sites that are in Virginia now. 300,000 solar modules on 900 acres. This is Accomack County. 900 acres produces 80 megawatts. Chesterfield Power Station, that one unit at Chesterfield is over 600 megawatts. So here you got 900 acres for 80 megawatts. Southampton County, I mean, you can see it, Correctional. This is our solar site here, 250 acres, produces 20 megawatts. And there's a lot more. Obviously, we've seen more. Anywhere you drive in the state now, you can see them, and likely there's more coming, right? There's a big push to develop these renewables. A lot of legislation has been passed to promote it. Whether you believe in carbon emissions or global warming or whatever, this is the trend in the industry right now. This is the way we're going. So here's some photographs of some of the big solar farms. So notice what's in common between these two? Amazon. So why solar? So I thought this was a pretty interesting nugget. Most abundant energy resource on Earth, 173 terawatts. Strikes the Earth continuously. That's more than 10,000 times the world's total energy use. That's a lot of power, right? So you remember these guys. They only needed 1.21 gigawatts. So that amount of solar input is enough for 142 million DeLorean time machines. That's one for each of us. Let's get out of here and go back in time. So the solar sites that we're here to discuss, and among other topics, you can see you have solar panels that are arranged in strings. By connecting them in series this way, it adds the voltage. Then you add the strings in parallel, which adds the current. This is basically solar panels take the sun's light, just like a plant with photosynthesis, and produces a DC power, just like what's in a battery. Well, the power that's on the grid is AC. It's alternating. So the magic happens right here in the inverter, where this device, through the use of power electronics, takes this DC power, converts it to AC, runs it through a transformer, and pushes it into the grid. Okay, so when the sun's shining, in theory, if you're an electric utility and you've got 100 megawatts of load, and you got a generator that you fire up at night to provide that 100 megawatts, we have a bunch of data viewers, on my job I can look at, and you can look at the time of day when that sun comes up, and you can see the solar production go right on up. And as that goes up, that 100 megawatts that your generator's producing, you don't need that power anymore, because now it's being produced by solar. So you can ramp that unit down or take it offline. But that poses challenges because a lot of our big units, you don't start them and stop them easily, right? Particularly nuclear, when you bring a nuclear unit online, it comes on slow, you bring it up to max, and you let it run. 6, 8 months, whatever it is, 12 months until its next maintenance cycle. You don't ramp those up and down. The big units, what we call base load, you bring them online, and they run. Now, we do have smaller units that you can add, that you can do things with, but when you invest $1.3 billion in a power station, there's economic forecasts that have to be done, and you're going to calculate, I'm going to expect these units to be running 48 weeks out of the year, and as they're running, they're printing money. Right? That's when the company's making profit. If the unit is not running, they're losing money. So to recover the investment and everything, they have economic forecasts, and now with solar, if they're starting it, stopping it, starting it, stopping it, all those forecasts go out the window. And so it changes the impact this is having is really beyond, there's really no simplified explanation. It is a revolution in the energy market is what it is. Challenges with renewables. So for wind, if the wind ain't blowing, those turbines aren't doing you any good. So you got to locate them at a place that has, the right amount of wind at the right time. Or if the wind is blowing too hard, that can be a problem. If you have ice on a turbine blades, and these turbine blades, by the way, if you've never seen the videos, these are hundreds of feet long. And they've got to put them on special trailers and everything to get them in a position. It's crazy. They can be noisy, and they're dangerous for flying animals. Solar, what happens at night? Those solar panels produce nothing, right? Or maybe you might get some output if it's a full moon, I don't know, but you're not getting much energy out of a solar panel at night. Panels get dusty, covered in snow, et cetera. Efficiency drops off. It's cloudy. And, of course, they require a lot of cleared land, lost habitat. So overcoming the challenges, again, siting using historical meteorological data. Where's the windiest location? Where's the sunniest location? I want good, we're in the northern hemisphere. Your solar site should have good southern exposure, right? Preferably flat land or kind of sloped facing south. You don't want it to be on the backside of a hill where you don't get the maximum sun. So there's a lot of, and there may be some solar experts here that can speak to that, but you also have refined turbine blade design. Like I said, just the two turbines that we built, that Dominion has built, are 600 feet high. The next ones that are coming, I think, are almost 900 feet high, and the turbine blades are longer. So they continue, the technology evolves. I don't know if anyone's ever driven out through the Midwest here in the past 10 years, but you see these big solar farms everywhere, or wind turbines everywhere out in the West. Minimizing, for cloud cover, you spread solar sites around, so if it's cloudy here, hopefully it's sunny there. It averages out. Now, so this thing down here, the battery storage, I call it the yin to the solar yang, right? Solar produces during the day. It doesn't produce at night. But if you had excess solar during the day and you use that excess to charge these big industrial batteries, which then discharge into the grid at night, those two kind of work together. So that's the direction. And you can see the big companies that have got involved, Tesla, Siemens, Mitsubishi. I gave you all a handout. There are 2 Tesla megapacks in New Kent County right now, a correctional substation. And these things are about the size of a pod, roughly. And you could put 2 of them, 10 of them, 100 of them, depending on what the capacity is that you want for that facility. But I would, and I'm speaking off the cuff here, but a 20-acre battery storage site could probably store the energy of 10 of our Barhamsville solar projects, right? So it's a much smaller footprint, and it's kind of more energy dense, right? So you could take 10 solar farms and run them into one battery storage and a much smaller footprint. And then one of the pluses to solar projects is if you're installing a solar project, generally speaking, they're going to go on a cleared piece of land, also known as a farm or something, tobacco farm down in North Carolina. They're going in like crazy. People don't want to grow tobacco. It's not profitable, whatever. Flat cleared land, perfect. You lease your land to a solar company for X amount of years. They put in the solar panels and everything, but they also have to upgrade the electric service into that solar site. So if you live down the road from a solar site, you're going to get new utility poles, new conductors, everything. That whole circuit will be updated, which in theory gives you better, more reliable power. You still live near a solar site, but in theory, your electrical infrastructure has been updated to accommodate that solar installation. And this is just a picture. So this is what the Tesla Megapack looks like. It's just a random. I don't know what manufacturer this is, but looks like to me it's in an existing substation. They added some battery storage units in there. And then that link, that handout that I gave you, will this work? Is there Wi-Fi in here? Okay. This takes you to that handout that I gave you. Do we not have Wi-Fi?
I don't think so.
Oh. I thought you were laughing like we're in New Kent. Why would we have Wi-Fi in the county building? Oh, hold on.
We do have one.
There it goes. Okay, so this is a handout that I just gave to you all discussing the battery storage pilot program that Dominion has at Correctional Substation right now. Okay. Any questions? Sir?
In my reading and digesting of some of this information on battery storage, part of the reason for battery storage is because of response time, because batteries are much more willing to release their energy than ramping up a generation facility, whether it be coal-fired, natural gas, or whatever. Is that correct?
If you close a switch, if your batteries are charged and you close a switch, they will immediately discharge into the grid. I mean, that's what they're for.
And then the second question regarding batteries is, I'll preface this by saying I've seen electric cars that have had fires, and it's very, very difficult to extinguish a battery fire. Mm-hmm. So that would be a deficit or a pullback measure on battery storage, correct?
Well, I'm not an expert on these. I did look at one of these, and in this cabinet right here, you have like a central operating center in one of the bays. All these others are battery storage over here, but these things come with cooling systems, fire suppression, all that stuff is embedded. When this thing gets unloaded, literally you set it on the foundation and you connect it up. So it has a lot of these systems already built into it, but if it catches fire, I can't speak to that. Maybe Mr. Davis can. I don't. I'm not a fire suppression expert.
I think we would just leave it alone and stuck in the exposure, so there's nothing.
It would probably be like a transformer in a substation where if Providence Forge substation, if a transformer catches fire there, it's going to burn until it burns out. And you isolate the area and stuff, but you can't.
And that's what I've seen, and that basically you just stand back and let the fire extinguish on its own accord, but there's no real firefighting practice that is a positive result of trying to save whatever the item burning is. It's just let it extinguish itself.
So as an employee of Dominion Power, if there's a fire in a substation, he's not coming in, and he knows that.
Yeah.
He's not coming in. So that's the policy, and because it's dangerous. I mean, you spray water on an electrical fire, that's a bad day.
Most fire departments do not have the appropriate chemicals.
Right. And then even those chemicals now, are they environmentally sound? Like I was in the Navy, we used AFFF for everything and sprayed it around like it was nothing. And you can't, there's restrictions on that now. But you can see in this picture, how the spacing between the units and certainly different localities can require certain spacing between the cells, whatever. So if there's a fire, it doesn't spread. I mean, that would be kind of a topic here, I think, and maybe even Dominion. I don't know what Dominion standards are if they have any for this.
Usually, public utilities are exempt from building code requirements. So it'd be manufacturer's best practice or recommendations.
One more item that came to mind is back when I was working, I was a site engineer for Dominion out at Surrey.
Okay.
And they were going through generator exchange or upgrades there. That was about 10 years ago.
Okay.
To go from basically 3%
Right.
more efficient generators. I predict that those are probably supposed to be 30-year, 40-year lifespan, if not longer.
So you're talking about the licensing on the units, or?
Well, I'm talking about just, there's those investments to keep these generators going. How much longer are we expected to, could Dominion practically keep like North Anna or any coal-fired or natural gas-fired facility online?
So as a member of the public, I've not heard any discussion about retiring nuclear units, right? Now, coal-fired units, you can read in the paper where Dominion has shut them down for one reason or another. But I've never heard anything about shutting down nuclear units. That's really base load stuff where on the coldest night of the year, when the wind's not blowing and the solar panels aren't producing, you need to have the old style generation running so that we can all watch Netflix, right? I mean, that's really what it is. And there's no substitute for that. Now, battery storage possibly, if it develops enough, could replace it at night. But even then, you have a battery that as you're using it, it's discharging, right? And so eventually it has to be recharged. So if the sun comes up the next day, you've discharged your batteries, and it's a cloudy day or whatever, your solar panels don't produce. So there's just a lot of kind of TBD.
But you don't see an avenue where we're 100% solar in the next 40 years. You think it's a combination of coal-fired, natural gas-fired, and solar and wind and what? I mean, what's Dominion predicting?
I can't speak for Dominion, but I can tell you if you follow what happened in Texas this past winter, where they had a lot of renewables. There were a lot of different things that went into the crisis that happened in Texas, but they weren't equipped for really cold weather. So a lot of their natural gas-fired units, when they needed them, they couldn't run them because compressors had frozen and things like that, so they didn't have adequate gas supply. But they had wind turbines they had to shut down because of ice buildup on the blades, and they were unbalanced, so they had to shut down turbines. They had solar that wasn't producing. People died because it was frigid cold weather, and they didn't have adequate electrical supply. In Texas, as you would expect, does its own thing. They're completely disconnected from the eastern and western grid, so they were on their own. And as a result, now I hope that all the utilities learn from that, and that we have that we develop an electrical system that is robust enough to handle those kind of bumps. But do I see 100% solar? I would guess no. Do I see 100%? Nuclear now is considered green. I grew up in the 60s and 70s where nuclear was anything but green. Now it's considered green because it's no carbon emissions. So I think, honestly, I don't know what the future holds. I think we're in a transitional stage, going from old style generation. I think we're probably passing through the solar stage, and then we'll get to cold fusion, and all our problems will be solved.
There's something that has to be beyond this.
Sure. Laura, I know you're in the electric industry as well. Do you have anything you want to add? Corrections if I made any mistakes or anything? No,
I mean you made the points that I always try and make, especially with solar. The amount of area that is taken up to produce the same amount of megawatts is substantial. But
I'd love to see what I call stack solar, where you have translucent panels where the top layer catches 50% and then the next layer catches 40 or something, where you could get more solar into less area.
Yeah.
And there are windows in office buildings and stuff now that have embedded solar, but it's not really gotten to the point where it's an industrial level yet. But
Yeah, there's still the technology, even the fact that there's been solar panels around for a lot of years, frankly, but the technology is still constantly changing and evolving, and it's going to have to meet the future needs.
and I don't think electric demand from one year to the next has ever gone down. So think about that.
I'm sure the last couple is going on.
I grew up in a house with one TV. My kids are growing up in a house with 6 or 7 TVs, right? Just as a measuring stick. And so our demand for electricity, well, it's just never diminished. So, any other questions?
I have one. What's the lifespan of these batteries? And then what happens at the end of the lifespan for these
Great question.
great big batteries?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. And honestly, you could ask the same question about solar panels. What happens when they retire? Where do
That
they
was
go?
my next question.
Those are questions that are beyond my scope. I have some of the same questions. I don't have answers for you. Batteries, I think, are probably, and I can't say this. We recycle batteries now. Now, I don't know how much of a battery can be recycled or how clean that process is. I don't know about solar panels. And when you see some of these solar sites, individual sites that have over 300,000 solar panels, that's a big hole you have to dig to bury those things if that's the solution 30 years from now.
Yeah. Well,
Where do
they are designed to be recycled at the end of their life, because
Okay.
there's a lot of heavy metals, precious metals, in amongst all the other inert materials that are in there. So, but it's still we haven't gotten to the end of the life of any of these big solar farms yet. So, no, yeah, we can say, oh well, yeah, they're going to be recycled, but
I think the expectation is when the demand is there, an industry will emerge to handle that.
yeah,
Honestly, if you buy a drill at Lowe's and that battery pack goes dead, you can take it back to Lowe's and put that dead battery right there in customer service. They have a collection point for batteries. I wonder if companies that make solar panels, should they be responsible for the disposal
well,
on the back end? I mean, I don't know.
frankly, if I were in that business, I would have recycling facilities in the works for future years,
Yes.
and where you shift employees from the manufacturer
Manufacture
to
today,
recyclers.
recycle tomorrow.
Yeah.
I agree.
But yeah, we really don't know. But I think the biggest considerations, we can try and put some types of stipulations on the decommissioning and putting the land back to not necessarily a green field, but back to some other usable form. But
And I've never seen a solar lease, but what I understand, and this is all extemporaneous, information. But if you lease your land, one of the conditions is when the lease is up, if you don't renew it, they are supposed to restore the land, pull out all the concrete pilings, pull out the solar panels, everything, and you get your tobacco field back. I've not read the fine print. I don't know if that, and in that sense, in a way, a solar farm could almost be interpreted as land management, right? Like if you have a 1,000-acre farm, and maybe I don't know, each of us can decide, would that be better if we put houses on it and all the demands that houses produce with schools and whatnot, or if you put solar panels there and then 20 years from now those solar panels go away, you've still got that 1,000 acres, not a single house on it. So I try to look at it from different angles.
it's a good point, because you are in some way potentially preserving the use of that agricultural land, but
In a weird way, like that's my weird logic. I think that's almost like land preservation in a weird way. If that makes sense.
And actually, the solar farm can't be in an AFD, but it sounds like an agricultural forest district, it would be a very appropriate because it is using the land
Right.
as a cornfield would.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not available.
So this is where, everyone is going to develop their own opinions, right? I mean, we all like to drive by farms at 60 miles an hour and see the crops and the livestock and everything, and it's real picturesque as you drive by. Probably more picturesque than a solar farm, and that's kind of the issue that we're faced with here, because there's a huge demand now, and the legislation has been passed to kind of encourage and promote the development of renewable resources, including solar and wind and battery storage. So if we're going to discuss this, we should kind of make sure we include all the different variations, not just solar, in my opinion.
Mr. LaRochelle,
Sir.
I think we've all been very accustomed to the primary generating facilities and the reliability of those. I mean, they've been around 50, 60, up to 100 years, but there is drawbacks to solar or wind. I mean, one's not just weather, but there's got to be other drawbacks, because my reading says it's great, but it doesn't have quite the same reliability as.
So I'm going back to Chesterfield Unit 6, 650 megawatts, is big steam turbine that's rolling, right? 3,000 RPMs, rolling. When there's a fault on a transmission grid, that generator, the inertia of that generator keeps it going, right? Like it can ride through certain faults. Whereas these inverters at solar sites, when there's a fault of a certain magnitude, it just trips, and you lost that generation altogether. So the old style, the mass of that turbine spinning gives it a certain amount of ride-through characteristics for electrical faults that solar sites just don't have. And that solar site, like I said, it produces DC power, which is a straight line. And that inverter is going to take that and put it into an approximation of a perfect sine wave. But if you zoom in, it's actually little increments. So it's not a perfect sine wave, and there's harmonics, there's other aspects that can prove challenging. And depending on sensitive equipment or whatever, like that, inverter-based power can pose problems, right? So it's not the perfect solution. I would not say that is a perfect solution. It is a solution, and it solves the problem of, in theory, it solves the problem of emissions, but what about the back end? You still have stuff to deal with on the back end.
I think one of the things we have to remember what our position here is, and that's the judging of if it's appropriate for land use, not whether it's going to take care of the grid or not. That is for Dominion, for everybody else to figure out. We're getting ordinances together and zoning together to decide if it be appropriate on land, not whether that energy is going to be taking care of what we need or not.
There'll be some people that see this as an opportunity and some people that are opposed to it, right? And so if we find a way where for those that want to take advantage of this, it is a really uniquely, for years and years and years, if you had power lines running across your property, that was kind of a disadvantage, right? Particularly if you had high voltage power lines running across your property, that was a negative. Today, it could be a positive where it gives an easy connection to the grid. And, implementing some of the setbacks and the different things that I know, Mr. Bennett, that you researched, and the papers that I had looked at that Kelly provided, different localities are doing it differently. So that's our job, is to look at that and balance landowner rights versus community, what's best for the community. Anyone else? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good evening, and thank you again for having me back here. I think it was a couple months ago I was here. Great presentation, Gary. I really got a lot out of that. And some of the questions you raised, I can probably provide a little bit of context, because observing what's been happening in the General Assembly. The first, Gary did a great job explaining kind of the land use calculation, 5 to 10 acres per megawatt. One of the things that I did at the beginning of this session, and it has to do with some legislation that we're in support of, was just to talk about what's been already built in Virginia, so you get an idea of scale. 6,235 megawatts are in service, under construction, or in the procurement stage for solar. And I got this from what's known as the PJM-Q. If you do the calculation, and I just always do 10 acres per megawatt because it's easy, it's a multiplier, and you come out to about 97 square miles. Obviously, that's distributed throughout Virginia. Virginia is very large. What's in the queue right currently, so this has been applied to go for interconnection, is 40,508 megawatts. So that's 6 times what's already in service or under construction. And when you do kind of the quick math on that, that's 633 square miles. Now, what's interesting about this is just a little bit of an update, and Gary, you may have seen this in the news. PJM, which runs the eastern part of the grid, has indicated, well, first off, they're going to do new rules for interconnection because they're getting so flooded with so many of these, and it's hard to figure out what's going to be built and how you're going to fit it into the grid to make all these things work, as he was pointing out. They've actually indicated they may be considering about a 2-year pause button on new interconnections just based on this, to just try to get a handle on it. So it's kind of interesting. The other part, just because we started talking about energy storage, there's 4,608 megawatts of energy storage projects that have applied for the grid. Most of those are the battery energy storage systems, I would think. Just a second thing on the batteries, I had a good conversation with a developer who's an independent developer, and he said, rule of thumb, it's about a 1/4 acre per megawatt. But it was interesting, you showed the picture of the spacing between these things, and my understanding is that when Dominion went out for an RFP to independent producers of these storage facilities, is that they were getting pushback from the independent people because they didn't like the spacing requirements that Dominion had. But Dominion's point of view was they were worried about if you get a thermal runaway, you don't want one of these things just kind of chain reaction. So Dominion is looking out for you in that respect, just to know. Yeah. I do think too there was one case that happened outside of Phoenix that really caught everybody's attention, and even though it injured some firefighters, sent them to the hospital. Thankfully, nobody lost their lives. But I think because of that, there was kind of a nationwide recognition to the point earlier. If these things catch fire, you don't send in first responders. You just let them go. The one question that you may want to consider potentially is, and you may want to bring in an expert, if they are catching fire, you let them burn. There are going to be some gases coming off that. You may just want to get some ideas if how toxic they are, what are their lingering effects potentially. The third thing I wanted to point out, because, and I know I'm going to get into land use, and I think you make a good point not to worry about how we're generating the energy, but just to point out, the Virginia Clean Economy Act doesn't say that it has to be 100% non-greenhouse gas emitting, and that's it. What it actually says is we have these goals of getting there, but only if the grid can be reliably produce the energy at base load and provide it. And I think what I've seen in certain Dominion RFP, or Dominion, what's known as an integrated resource plan, is they have backup contingencies for rapid fire gas units to come online to address that issue. And it kind of flows back into the batteries. The current storage, and I served on a SCC work group on this, and I learned this. The current storage technology is great right now because it provides a lot of ancillary services to the grid. Providing, to meet the fluctuations in power demand, providing reactive power for the grid. But what we learned from a series of experts in this is that once Virginia reaches 50% renewables as their base load, and that's wind and solar, that the battery energy storage systems, the current lithium-ion technology are not going to be good enough to meet that base load when we need it. And so we've already started looking at future, long-term duration beyond kind of the 4 hours. And some of the things that I've seen out there is maybe, using solar, and this was a concept that's been floated in Charles City County, but at a natural gas plant that's been proposed there that's kind of on the skids a little. That's a whole nother story. But one of their ideas was to do a demonstration with Mitsubishi where they're going to put in about 25 megawatts for solar. they're going to use the energy when it's not needed for the grid to split hydrogen from water, store that hydrogen on site, and then use that hydrogen to burn in the gas units that they're doing. So it's kind of an interesting way to get at the long-term duration. So I just had to hit on those. And then you heard me laugh when you were talking about fusion. It always reminds me, I read a lot of science magazines, and the joke is we're always 50 years away from fusion reactors. Do you remember where it is? Yeah.
5-second sustained fusion reaction in the UK.
That's right, recently. Yeah, it was big news. Yeah, 5 seconds. So. That's exactly, yeah. And I will touch on one thing, just on the land use, because it was a good point. And one of the questions I've kind of had is, as you approve these projects, you're approving the land for that use. And although the life cycle of these panels may be 35, 40 years, you could still use it for that use. So they could replace those and go back. So you may not necessarily, but it depends really on what the market and what the energy technologies are at that time. It may be that the panels are much more effective and you could use less land for it, maybe reclaim some of the land, but still have some solar generation there. Let's see if this, did I lose? Oh, there's cursor. Do I just go, how do I do this, Kelly? Oh, there we go. These few slides that I'm going to show, these are actually, they should be somewhat familiar, but I thought I'd just have this as kind of a review talking about, what is it that localities have in terms of their authority, and particularly on some changes in the General Assembly. And I talked about this in depth last time, so I won't go too much into it, but the solar siting agreement law from a couple years ago, which applies now to not just solar at greater than 5 megawatts, but also battery storage greater than 5 megawatts. It gives you a lot of ability to address a lot, not only of land use issues, but revenue issues. And so, I've got it here. I think it's in your notes, so I won't go too much into that. And part of the reason why I'm doing this bit of a review is that some of the legislation that's in the General Assembly kind of ties into some of this, so I wanted to give that as background. The other option you have is to get away from what's known as the machinery and tool tax. In lieu of doing machinery and tool tax, you could do what's known as revenue share. I just like to call it an energy tax because really that's what it is. And it gives you a certain amount of predictability in terms of the amount of revenue that you would get on a yearly basis from these. And there's an escalator that was built in to consider, inflation. So that's just another decision point. The way it is currently now is you use, your machinery and tool tax. If you wanted to do this, you would pass an ordinance, and it would apply to anything greater than 5 megawatts. And this was another slide that I had. Obviously the land use considerations, compatibility with agriculture and forestry, the decommissioning, returning the land to pre-existing conditions, all these things you've touched on, erosion and sediment control, and stormwater runoff. Stormwater runoff, I think, based on some discussions that I've heard up in the General Assembly, there may be some more scrutiny from DEQ on how they calculate what is the stormwater runoff from these facilities. Because currently, in kind of a quirk in DEQ's permitting of these, and which you also do at the local level, they count these as pervious surface, the actual panels. And I think there's a recognition amongst a lot of stormwater experts that that's not really the case. I've seen things where in Minnesota they've calculated as what they've called disconnected impervious surface. So it's not necessarily channelizing, but it is creating a certain amount of runoff. There's obviously been issues you've probably seen in the news, especially during the construction phase. If you have 2 to 3 inches of rain during the daytime and you're in the construction phase, you are going to see some runoff events. So I think that's something to look out for as you move forward. I touched on this, the transmission lines. You do have the ability to contact the utilities and say, hey, what are your plans for transmission lines? Because I thought you made a really good point, which is, you have transmission lines and capacity going through your county. How does that match up with potential land that might be available? Of course, there's so much money and investment coming in these things that it doesn't necessarily follow transmission lines. I know of one case where there's an 800 megawatt facility being proposed in Charlotte County. And at that scale and the amount of investment and the amount of dollars coming in from Wall Street, it doesn't matter where the transmission lines are and the substations. They're going to build them to get the power to the market. So what I wanted to do was kind of give you a quick update, and these are rather significant. And I think I touched on this at our last meeting. I was here a couple months ago. You know, I talked about how there is a state-mandated exemption if you use the M&T model, which is your current model, where anything greater than 5 megawatts, you get a mandatory 80% exemption. It goes down to 70% during the next 5 years, after the first 5 years, and then 60% throughout the life of the project. Just as a quick note, it doesn't apply to anything 150 megawatts or greater. It's just in that greater than 5 megawatt and just under 150 megawatt. But there's a current 100% exemption for 5 megawatts or less. And so there's a couple bills, one in the Senate and one in the House, that I expect fully to become law. They're actually supported by the solar industry. And I think what they were running into was they were putting in a lot of smaller 5 megawatt facilities that would take up anywhere from 35 to 50 acres of land. And there's quite a market for it because they provide quite a bit of service to the grid, because you can place them right next to a substation. They provide a lot of ramped up power in a short period of time. So these bills would put this on par with that same 80, 70, 60 current exemption. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that the way that the bill is worded, it shall not exceed your local real estate rate. So whatever your real estate rate is, that's as much as you can charge, per the assessed value on these things. Why that's interesting is that currently anything 25 megawatts or less, you apply what is your M&T rate. Anything greater than 25 megawatts, and this has been baked into state law for a long time, for any electric generating facility, regardless of type, you apply your real estate rate. So this is kind of a little variation in there just to kind of understand the nuances. If you adopt a revenue share, then it applies to those projects at 5 megawatts or less. Essentially, if you adopt revenue share, that's what you're going to use for any of these projects, regardless of their size, including the 150 megawatt or beyond. And the last part of this that's important is it shall not apply to projects that were approved by a locality prior to July 1 of 2022. So we'll see. I don't know if this will create a rush on the bank, for people, but it is why I'm more comfortable with this. It's not that they have to apply by that date, but they need the local approval. And so, that can take some time. I went the wrong way. This is a really interesting bill, and VACO has actually supported this, and for a lot of things that we've heard from a lot of our members, which I'll touch on in another slide. But what this would do is the current PBR process, the permit by rule through DEQ, currently during that process, the way it works is an applicant comes in, and to have a completed application, they have to show that they've gotten all the local land use approvals, that it meets all local ordinances. And when DEQ gets that, currently under law, if they see there's going to be any significant impacts to wildlife resources or historic resources, then the applicant needs to show how, they're either avoiding first, minimizing those impacts, or mitigating those impacts. And the way it's worked, DEQ will fish it out to the various agencies. For wildlife resources, it'll fish it out to the Natural Heritage Resource Division in DCR. For historic, it goes to the Department of Historic Resources. And once they've shown that they've mitigated those or avoided or mitigated those things, then boom, stamp, they get the letter and they go on. What this bill would do would just add to that impacts to farm and forest land resources. And so it is going through the legislative process. I can tell you that there is some consternation amongst some of the solar independent producers about this. They're worried that this is putting the kibosh on solar. I don't necessarily see it that way. I almost see it as kind of a nice prudent measure to give localities some comfort level that these things are being looked out for. And as part of that mitigation for farms, we can start to be creative. Maybe when a project comes in and they do all their grading, if they strip all the topsoil off, maybe they set that topsoil to the side, and then once all the panels are in place, they put that topsoil back on underneath the panels. Those are just some thoughts that I had in thinking about it, but there could be lots of creative ways to avoid and mitigate that. It's important to note that the bill would not apply to any applications or applications received by DEQ prior to the promulgation of those regulations, because they're going to have to kind of go through the regulatory process, and that takes about 2.5 years on average, or by December 31st, 2024, so whichever comes first. One thing to note, when I was here last time, and I didn't include these slides, I told you that DEQ was undergoing a revision to the PBR process and what those implications may be. That process has been fully on hold. It was on hold with the previous administration, the previous governor's administration. It's on hold with this administration. I have a sneaking suspicion they may not go forward based on some of the things we're seeing, particularly with this law, that they may kind of hit the pause button on that and relook at those. So that's something to be aware of. But I could be wrong. They could come out tomorrow. We don't know. It's kind of in a dark area there. This last piece of legislation, and I think this is a really good piece, it really looks at providing more, I think, resources to localities in terms of how you get these things and you look at the land use impacts and how it fits in with your community. The first is developing a map and a repository of prime farmland that potentially could be something that would be easily accessible online. I think some of this is already out there, but I think this is really trying to refine this, and it's going to do it with the various agencies, Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, Department of Forestry, DCR. I wrote out Department of Energy. It used to be the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy, DMME, but now they're Department of Energy. I didn't want to put DOE because you would think it was Department of Education, and I wouldn't want to confuse you there. The other part here is entering into agreements with nonprofit groups for looking at different land values out there, particularly with conservation easements or lands that have agricultural potential. So trying to really find, what's the land that's more suitable towards this type of uses. So I think that's important. And then the last part here I think is really critical is you can work now, if this becomes law, with Dominion and Appalachian to identify where is the capacity in the network and where can you start locating these things that make sense. And one thing here is I think is critical is that it wouldn't be subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. So it kind of protects, I think, a lot of the proprietary interests of the utilities. It's interesting, when I was in Rockingham County, and I may have mentioned this in my last meeting here, they were concerned about this very issue. They said, if the county's all open to development, where's the capacity truly there that would tend to serve this so that we can funnel, land, that type of development there. And it actually began a discussion between some people with Dominion and Rockingham County, and apparently it's been very fruitful. And so that could be something similar that New Kent could do, even without this legislation. So those were the big items. The last thing I wanted to touch on, and I didn't put it on here on the slide, is VACO has put forward legislation both in the House and the Senate. In the House side, it's House Bill 774, and the patron is Delegate Keith Hodges, who's from the Middle Peninsula. And then on the Senate side, it's Senate Bill 499, which is Senator Lewis, who's from Northampton County, or Accomack County, I'm sorry, but also represents parts of Accomack. And it's to get at some of the issues you were just talking about at some of the questions for Gary, which is the life cycle issues. And so the way it's worded, and I don't have it here with me, and I can provide it to Kelly, so that would be a good resource for you, is it directs the State Corporation Commission in consultation with various state agencies to bring together stakeholders to look at those life cycle issues, not only from the standpoint of where these materials may end up, but also opportunities for some of the recycling you were talking about, and what is the markets that are going to be there. I know in some of the work that we did with the State Corporation Commission Energy Storage Task Force, some of the things I learned is that the current lithium-ion technology, it's not built in a way that makes it easily recyclable, that you have to really separate a lot of these heavy metals, and so that kind of puts a kibosh on the market. But there may be some innovative ways to think about how you address some of these issues. And then lastly, and this has gotten a lot of support from agricultural interests, particularly Farm Bureau and also from Virginia Agribusiness and the Forestry Association, is how do you return that land at the end to production agriculture or forestry? You know, what would be, you know, the strategies and the costs? Because if you consider it, if you take something out of use and it's not active farmland, you know, a lot of those things that make soils productive, and if they're not generating, I mean, there could be some loss there, and how do you rebuild that? So that's kind of the big things going on in the General Assembly, and if you have any questions, I can try to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Lurch. One question that came to mind is any codes or legislation out there that promotes joint use of solar or renewable energy with current land uses so that we're not taking pristine land and convert it to, you know, renewable energy source?
I guess, are you talking at the utility scale then? Yeah. You know that as part of the DEQ PBR process, they have like a pollinator-friendly program. It's not necessarily, you know, a production use, but, you know, it's something that could have some benefit, particularly to adjoining landowners. You know, you've seen pictures probably of goats grazing under panels. I don't know how prevalent that is. You know, I have to say, I mean, I in some of the pictures, in fact, Gary showed, I mean, you know, you're just looking at straight converting it to solar generation, and I don't know if there's necessarily a market for trying to integrate uses. Maybe at a smaller scale, like on an agricultural operation. I think I've seen some things in Colorado where kind of a small scale agricultural operation may have 2 to 3 megawatts, combining it with what they're doing. But, you know, really you're talking about economies of scale is really kind of driving the equation. There might be some ways for the Commonwealth to provide more incentives for that. So that's a good question. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Brendan.
Thank you, Mr. Lurch.
All right, thanks, Joe, and thanks, Gary. I want to just follow up on what Joe said a bit with some comments on process and sort of where our zoning ordinance is with solar and sort of the process of land use approvals, both here at the Planning Commission, at the Board of Supervisors. The way we in New Kent right now handle solar farms is we do it by a conditional use permit approval. So that process is pretty familiar with you all. You all get an application into staff. It comes here. They make a recommendation with any conditions that they would like associated with it, and you guys make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors based on what conditions you want on them. The Board of Supervisors then ultimately approves or denies the rezoning request for it. State code allows that. Our local ordinance allows that. And so that's the general process that we'd follow here for these. With solar, unlike regular conditional use permits, the state code allows us to enter into siting agreements, which is something that the Board of Supervisors, it's an agreement that the Board of Supervisors has to have a public hearing on, and the Board of Supervisors approves. That does not, the siting agreement itself does not have to come before you. Your recommendation is on the conditional use permit application itself. So remember your role here in the process. I'm just trying to go big picture because I know you've heard a lot. Your role here is again what Mr. Moyer said, is on the land use side of things. Is this use for this particular land, are these conditions reasonable? Are you comfortable making a recommendation to the board for approval for this particular project, or are you not? That's your role. The siting agreement is something the Board of Supervisors votes on and has a public hearing on, but again, that's at the Board of Supervisors level. Just to follow up on what Mr. Lurch said about the revenue sharing, he's of course correct on everything he said. That again is whether the county decides to do a revenue sharing or tax approach to solar farms is, again, that's a board of supervisors. They would have to adopt an ordinance. So just want to make that clear from a procedural standpoint that we'll follow the conditional use permit process. One of the things, Ms. Leduc may speak to this later, but getting back to where we began this conversation with the board asking about performance standards, I did look at a couple other localities and how they, in the area, and how they regulate solar and what their process is. Some localities do it the same way New Kent is doing it right now without performance standards. They just have a conditional use permit process, and each case individually they add their conditions that they feel appropriate. Most of them are probably from a standard book. Maybe Mr. Bennett will speak to this later too. I looked at Albemarle, Hanover, Goochland, I think, are those who just do a conditional use permit. Louisa and I think Caroline are two other localities that, in addition to having the conditional use permit process, have a set of performance standards that apply out the gate, essentially, to each solar project. Staff with Mr. Hathaway is in the process of developing those, a draft set of standards that deal with setbacks, buffers, vegetative requirements, decommissioning, sureties, those types of things that you were, I think, touching on some of the issues with. So I think the plan process-wise is for the draft, for staff to develop that draft, make sure that the board is comfortable with it, since it's ultimately going to have to go with them conceptually, bring it back to you in March with the actual language for you to then consider recommending to the board on whether to approve these or not. Let me stop there because I think procedurally those are the main points that I wanted to get at, not only on the performance standards, but just on individual projects coming before you down the road. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, sir. Seems like I got a lot of questions. In my review of the various ordinances and itemized performance standards, it looks like that some localities have an actual ordinance on renewable energy or solar energy facilities, and then some localities have, I want to say, a policy that is not an ordinance, but it's a list of expected conditions that the applicant satisfy or substantially satisfy. Did you encounter the same thing in your review?
The latter I'm not familiar with. I'd be happy to look at specific examples if you have them, but I don't think Louisa or Caroline were the ones that I looked at that had specific performance standards. The other localities did it by conditional use permit. So if you're going to approve these without performance standards and you want it to be binding on the applicant, then you would need to put those as conditions to the conditional use permit that's approved rather than just have a policy.
Understand that my idea is that if it's a policy, that's something that we're looking for, or that we think should be incorporated into a conditional use permit, whether it's provided by the applicant or not, or performed by the applicant or not. It provides a desire in where we like to see it focused. Basically, it's a list of where we like to focus. The second thing you mentioned was site agreements. In my reading, I kind of took that term site agreement and said proffer. Is that incorrect to make that same similarity?
There are different words, but similar concepts, yes. Okay. Yes. Joe? Yeah. why the General Assembly chooses the words it does is more Joe's how the sausage is made than me.
I might have said this last time I was here, but you know, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying it. It's almost like proffers on steroids. And why I say that is, if you follow the history of proffers for residential developments, the General Assembly has really peeled back what you can negotiate with developers. This, on the other hand, and by the way, the developers endorsed this concept, opens it up wide, and I think that's a fair assessment. Yeah, and to your, you know, Mr. Brent, to your point on the policies, you know, one thing it'd be interesting to know is whether those policies are part of the comprehensive plan, because I think if they're there, I think that kind of makes a little more sense, but I don't know.
Again, in my review of some of the ordinances and outline research is, and I'll throw out there, Pennsylvania County has what I thought was a fairly narrow band of the ordinance, yet if you look at other readings, they have a quite extensive list of policies that they'd like to see renewable energy land uses adopt or abide by. Same with Prince George's County. That's why I'm wondering if is policy, what would be the best route for New Kent County to go by, whether establish an ordinance or with SUPs, or have a policy so that an applicant kind of knows what he's working for or against.
Well, I think as a legal matter, you can do either or. What's the best is up to you guys that's in the county. What I think you'll see process-wise is that the staff is going to present to you with some performance standards that essentially are that, and then that will inform the applicants, at least in terms of setbacks, vegetative buffer requirements, so screening can't be screened from a highway, it's got to be so many feet back from a road, those types of standard concerns that each solar project has to do. So I would suggest we start there and see what that says and have you react to that. The other part which Joe mentioned and is appropriate for a discussion at the Planning Commission is that we are in the process generally of updating our comp plan. We're trying to pick a consultant, we're trying to do that. So when you all do that, when that process is started and you have input on it, I think you will have an opportunity there to inform where you want to see solar development happen in the county as part of the comp plan revision. So that won't be done now, and we're not going to just change the comp plan, you know, in the next 2 months, but that process should be, I don't know, Kelly, this year. So you will have an opportunity to inform the location and the comp plan's approach to solar farm in the county. Mark, does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Thank you all.
Thank you, Brendan.
So, Madam Chair, and to the benefit of the commission here, over the last couple of weeks, I have reviewed and searched the internet quite widely in Virginia for Virginia localities that have some kind of policy or adopted ordinance regarding to renewable resources, particularly solar, since that's it looks like where the industry is focusing. I have provided each of you a handout, multiple sheet handout. I'll go over that in a minute. There are a couple more up here for people who who are interested in it. Kelly, if you would like to distribute those. So I'll begin by saying that the handout is broken down. If you look into categories, there's, I think, 4 categories, from basically siting to operational to incentives and then other considerations. And then there's the condition. The next column is the description of the condition associated with that category, and then reference to the jurisdiction that may have invoked or plan to invoke that kind of policy or condition. And I'll start out by saying that the first few of them that's listed there, and I won't pause on any single one of them, but the first few of them listed there, it has to do with zoning districts, either specifically allowing renewable resources in all zoning districts or specific zoning districts or specific zoning districts with the SUP. There is one that locality that I found that had a specific district that allowed for renewable resources, and that was in Northampton County. Joe may know of another one. They actually have a renewable resource district or a photovoltaic district or something of that nature. Further on, there is information of other jurisdictions regarding siting on minimum acreage. Some localities have minimum acres where solar or renewable could be established. I've seen the number 60 a couple times. I've seen no less than 25 acres associated with that. Or a maximum area or acreage countywide collectively that solar or renewable could be identified within the county. And then there are some siting criteria which there can be no more than X% of solar or renewable renewable energy facilities within a 5-mile radius or 10-mile radius or something of that nature. One of particular I saw, I believe it's in Pennsylvania County, that they have a 5-mile separation between renewable resources. That basically a new energy facility cannot be constructed within 5 miles of another. So basically spatially separating them. We mentioned setbacks. Setbacks come into various forms between landscape, visual, and vegetative setbacks. Many of the ordinances that I've reviewed have no direct observation of the energy producing facility from either adjacent residential communities or the roadway. One in particular had that if it's going to be vegetated, it had to be an extended distance from the roadways or the adjacent community, and it had to have mature trees. So you couldn't just augment what the current environment had. You had to make sure they matured. So basically thinking that this facility is going to be there for 25 to 30 years, it needs to be hidden from day one. New Kent is an example of prohibiting on agricultural forestal districts. James City County did something similar in the recent past, in which they actually subdivided the property off from the parent parcel and defined it as its own parcel for the solar facility. Another one that was kind of unique, and that was found in Prince George County, prohibited renewable energy facilities on public water and or public sewer districts. The thinking there was that there has been cost and infrastructure established to provide economic development, even though there may be some economic developers assigned with renewable resource generation, that it was slated for some other use than that particular use. At the end of page 1, there was in city of Chesapeake, they actually outlined some former or preferred sites, starting with former landfills, mining sites, existing wide utility easements, brownfield sites, and joint use like parking lots, industrial buildings, airport approaches, and low production agricultural lands.
Madam Chair, what Mr. Dillon is going through here, I think Mr. Hefty's already told us that staff is going to send us recommendations for all of these. I think that would be the time to review all these options from every county across the Commonwealth. They will give us a guideline to go by what they want us to look at as far as standards, setback requirements, and all that. So, I mean, we could talk all night about the whole state, but I think that would be the time to really get into the nuts and bolts of the setbacks.
Kelly, the one draft that we got, is that part of what you've put together already?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, then we've already got some of that. Okay, thank you.
I think in the interest of time, it would be good if we can all review what Mr. Bennett has put together. I do think that what we're dealing with right now is going to be some good basic standards and amendments to the ordinance until we can get the comp plan revised and then really do a more thorough forward looking approach to it with potential amendments to the comp plan maps, that type of thing. So I think we should move on to Kelly. The last item was really looking over you describing what you put together so far.
Yeah, that's what.
That is this.
Yeah, that's something that the other one that doesn't have the yellow is kind of one example of a draft that the staff has been talking about. The one with the yellow highlights is information from Louisa. Okay. And the things I like about that is that, A, they define all of the different kinds of solar first. You can see at the top, I just copied and pasted their definitions. And they do address smaller scale, which would be good as long as we're doing this, to get those definitions put into New Kent's ordinance, because we don't currently have any definitions for solar. So ours only talks about public or private electric generation facilities, so that would be good, I think. So we're kind of doing a mishmash of other good examples that we're finding. And to talk a little bit about what you guys were discussing, a policy versus an ordinance amendment. We feel that it'd be better approached right now as an ordinance amendment, putting in some performance standards. And then, like Joe was saying, when we do the comp plan update, we can do a whole section or a whole chapter or what have you on where it's appropriate for solar. So yeah, these are just kind of ideas that we've been talking about on a staff level, the drafts that I handed out tonight.
Okay. The quick question, because I'm just skimming through what Mr. Bennett had put together, and there's a lot of different considerations, and some of them I don't know what your general feelings were on potential inclusion of other than there's considerations for setbacks and height, fencing, all like that. Yeah, that seems pretty a little bit more standard. Yeah, but some of the other items maybe not so much. I mean, decommissioning and bond issues. Mm-hmm.
That would be standard.
Okay.
Yep, for all of them. Yeah, I mean, this is great, Mark. This is really helpful because we can see kind of what a lot of localities are putting into their rules or ordinances, and those are definitely things that we would cover for sure. I mean, some localities have unique situations, and maybe those are things that we wouldn't need to consider here in New Kent, but yeah, this is very helpful.
Kelly, not all of them would be needed. Some of them are standard quo, but some of them are of interest. For instance, Joe mentioned that the issue with regards to large clearing of land for the construction of the arrays or whatever the facility may be, where one jurisdiction actually said, okay, it's got to be in manageable sizes. You can't go out and do 200 acres at once because nobody has control over 200 acres at once per se.
Right.
You do need 200 acres, it creates a huge runoff issue.
Right.
So these were not to be all-inclusive and not all to be applied. It's just to give some open-minded thinking of where other jurisdictions were heading with it,
Right.
and it provide examples and just thought-provoking.
That's great. No, thank you, Mark. I'm going to take a couple more, actually.
I think it would be time well spent at some point, whether it's a comp plan or here, just an example, if we have it as a requirement for a vegetative buffer. Bamboo, conservation vegetative buffer, is that what we want?
Right.
Do we want holly trees? Do we want native species, like the devil's in the details. And, I think it's worth it on a lot of these points to go down to really specify contractors, if it's possible, that they solicit bids from businesses in the county, or as much work as possible, and things like that.
I think it is interesting, although I'm not sure we want to take the leap yet, but the fact that there are some counties that are putting density limits on the development. They can't.
They're going in different directions, right? Northampton is putting it all in one area.
Yeah,
other counties are spreading it
yeah.
out.
So, what's actually going to be best for New Kent is it'll be more interesting discussion.
All these are like their study of one, and these have been out maybe for a few years, and we're making decisions on what it's going to be like in the next 30 years. It's tough to judge which one of these is right. Even these people that already set rules, it's tough to judge what's right.
But I think that's the point of the discussion is because the ordinance is an ever evolving thing, especially related to these types of things where technology is changing so fast. So we just want to. I think we just want to be careful to try and start off with some good base standards that we can all agree on and that would be applied consistently, and then continue to work on and tailor it to what our vision is.
As long as Brendan's still here, I have a question, I guess, for you. If we do go the route of keeping the applications as a conditional use permit, but also having performance standards, the conditions can be more restrictive than the performance standards, correct? They can. And that's another thing to keep in mind. If we keep both processes, which is what I recommend, we can take these case by case, but also give the developers a better idea of what the kinds of things that we are going to be looking for.
I haven't looked at this yet, but is there any thought to there being the performance standards for one size, for say smaller ones, and where larger facilities would have to also get the conditional use permit? Is there any gradation that you've thought about, or is that?
We're right now we're looking at keeping the process the same regardless of size.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even for residential?
No, and that's another thing I wanted to point out about the Louisa example. Mm-hmm. Right now, the residential, we don't regulate in our zoning code at all. We don't define it. We don't get involved in the permitting on the planning side. They handle that all through the building code on the building side.
Okay.
I just do think it would be helpful, though, to add a definition at least into our code, which we had put in there anyway.
Well, something that I mentioned before is when does, if you have two uses on the property, when does one of them become primary use? For instance, somebody puts in a nice residential structure on a single parcel of land
Right.
and they put supportive solar for their use, but then they start adding to it and generating more and more revenue by selling the metered electrical power back to grid.
That's a good question. I don't have an answer.
Just for their house.
Yeah.
If they're only doing solar panels to support the energy for their house, that's fine. If they're selling power outside, if they're not supporting their own home, that's a different animal.
Yeah.
But almost all of these are selling power back to the grid.
Yeah. So
Almost every single one of them is selling power back to the grid.
Yeah, so the way that the net metering law works is for, and there's kind of two distinctions here, but for residential and commercial or office or whatever solar that you would generate on site to avail yourself of net metering, it has to be based on what your projected load would be for the year. So you really don't have that opportunity to sell more out to the grid. The only exception is for certain agricultural generators, you can go up to 150% of the load. That was an incentive to try to get some of this with some agricultural operations. But my last query, both Dominion and APCO said that hadn't been taken advantage of yet to their knowledge.
So if your projected load was, say, three megawatts, you're not going to be developing any more than that.
I would say
whatever the case
if
Megawatt solar installation
Yeah.
property.
on a,
Anticipated load of 3 megawatts.
yeah.
Would be prohibited.
well, yeah, I mean,
For under the net meter.
Under
Yeah,
the net metering.
net metering. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be one huge data center.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I it is interesting because there is a bill. It died in the House, but it's still alive in the Senate that would actually mandate for just rooftop solar for residential or otherwise, that would be a separate class of property as an improvement to the real estate and 100% exempt from local taxation. And what was interesting about that and kind of our research about that is that we learned that typically for your average household, the biggest they'll go is maybe 7 kilowatts, and they don't go much beyond that because there's just not a lot of need beyond that. So you see a lot smaller installations. For some institutional, I'll give you one example. I think it's Shenandoah University and then maybe W&L. They have systems there that are less than a megawatt, like maybe 800. So they really don't get that much larger based on the need.
Yeah.
I'd just like to thank Mr. Bennett for his research. I know it took you a lot of time. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to thank everybody, all the presentations, all the information, and all your time and effort, and it will not be in vain because we all need to understand the pressures on the utilities, the pressures on the land use, in order to make the informed decisions. So, if there's no other questions, I guess we will end the discussion and finish up the meeting. And the next item on the agenda is the chairman's report. I really don't have much to report. I think the biggest thing is that we've selected a consultant. That's Rodney is still working on the contract, and that'll go to the Board of Supervisors. But we should be hopefully starting the comp plan process relatively soon. Other than that, I don't have anything else pressing. Do any of the other commissioners have anything to report? Okay. And a plan RBA report? Is there
yeah.
anything to report on that?
But I'll just make it brief. I went to my first meeting on February 10th. And the three main things that were discussed were they are moving. They're not going to be in Stony Point anymore. So they voted on the location that they were going to go to. I think it's probably 6 months out, 6 months to 9 months out before they'll be moving. But they did choose the location of the current, which is on 400 Hull Street, instead of the Laburnum Interstate Center. So RVA will be moving. They discussed their branding briefly, and there was a presentation by Nora Amos from the town of Ashland on innovations in local planning. And you can see that on the website, and it was a pretty good presentation. That's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Pearson. Let's see. Staff report, Kelly?
All right, thank you. Just a little overview of the March meeting. We have been in touch with the folks from Liberty Landing. Dun, dun, dun. So they're back. They want to come and speak to the Planning Commission to give a presentation of where they are now in their latest PUD development. So I haven't gotten a 100% confirmation from them yet, but I know they're working on having some community meetings. And Tommy actually might know more than I do.
Yeah, March 6th at Patriots Landing.
Okay. Have they set one up with Five Lakes yet, or is it joint? Oh, great. Okay. So that's before our next Planning Commission meeting, so I'm going to guess that they want to come to just to give a presentation to you guys. Oh, really? I don't know why, but I could listen.
The public meeting is the 6th? Is that what you said?
Yeah, the public meeting
I'm
for Patriots Landing and for Five Lakes
For Patriots Landing.
is March 6th.
Okay.
And their presentation, first of all, we always have to remember, is to rezone the area from business to residential.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, their latest proposal, it does go the route of a PUD, which is good. They actually listened to us when we recommended that, so it's a mix of residential and business. But John's right. I mean, right now all the parcels are strictly zoned business, so they're proposing to take a good chunk of the business property and change it to residential. Let's see. The other things coming up, I'm going to have to get with Brendan and Mr. Hathaway and some other staff now to see the next step in the solar. I don't think we'll be ready to do a public hearing yet for you guys in March, but I'll get back with them after tonight. And thank you for all the good information and thoughts on that. And then the Borrego folks, they're actually here tonight. We did get their application in for their solar project, and they're requesting that we go ahead with the public hearing in March. Whether or not the commission feels comfortable at that meeting taking a vote, that's something that we can talk about, but we would like to hold their public hearing at the next month's meeting to get any comments from the public. And then the Faith Recovery CUP, Reverend Hall, that was here a couple months ago to present, they're ready to go to public hearing, and I think we're going to have quite a crowd for that one. So I'm going to double check with him to see if they're ready for the public hearing part yet. I still think they're trying to meet with some folks in that area to talk about their concerns first. But March is going to be potentially packed. So that's what I had so far for staff reports. Sherry, Kenny, am I forgetting anything? Okay. AFDs are coming up too, but not till the summer, right? Okay. The what? Oh, yeah, that's a good point. At the board meeting last month, the board did vote to approve Matt Starr's conditional use permit amendment. Yep, that's a good point. I think that's all I had for staff reports. Yeah, right. No.
I think the board had delayed vote on the Minotera, the lot size issue of Minotera. Has the final vote been taken on that? They want to reduce the lot size of Minotera? That's still on. It's staying the same.
Yeah.
Oh, the vote, okay. So
Yeah.
the vote was taken.
Yeah, that was a couple months ago. Yep. Yep, for Lambie one.
Okay. Sounds like March is going to be a packed agenda. So that will be Monday, March 21st at 6:30. Sounds like we will have several items to actually vote on. So if you cannot make it, please let Kelly know. But with that, any other comments? Anything else from any of the commissioners? If not, can I have a motion to adjourn? Thank you.